Let's go to our panel now. Jen Schradie joins me from the French city of Toulouse. She's an assistant professor at the Observatoire Sociologique de Changement. In our London studio, Joseph Downing, who's a fellow at the London School of Economics, who focuses on nationalism. And from Paris is TRT World's editor-at-large, Craig Copetas. I thank you all for joining us. Jen, let me begin with you. Macron says this is a legitimate anger. He says, I know I've hurt some of you. And he suspended the tax increase on fuel, increased the minimum wage, and so on. Is that going to be enough for those people on the streets?
That's the million-dollar question, right? So if I could tell you what was going to happen next, I'd be a millionaire and would know what is going to happen with the stock market, right? But I think what we do know is that Macron has responded to a very strong protest movement. What could happen is, and what I see watching online and being in the streets and talking to people, is that Macron's reaction to the protest movement is only inspiring more people to participate. They see what collective action can do. And their struggles economically have not yet gone away. So until these promises that have been made actually hit their pocketbooks, I predict that we're going to see this movement only grow in the long run.
Craig Copetas, let me bring you in here. Let me give you a little story. During the time of the French election, we discussed this a little bit, both on and off the camera. And perhaps when Macron had won and there was the election of a centrist, there were people in Brussels and elsewhere that breathed a sigh of relief, perhaps, elites all over the continent that had to breathe a sigh of relief. But did it, in a way, just put a lid on the fact that there were many who felt that their voice was best expressed by the far right, with the National Front and the Le Pens and so forth, or the far left with the likes of Mélenchon? Did France sort of forget that that undercurrent was still happening, and are we seeing the fruits of that happening right now?
What France forgot that it needed organized political parties. There is no longer a center-left or a center-right here in France. For some, nothing Macron can do or say will be enough. Whether his change of tone, contrition, the fiscal relief he's giving will help restore his authority depends entirely on public opinion and on street theater, because it's not going to come from the National Assembly where he holds a supermajority. Just earlier today, there were hundreds and hundreds of students on the streets of Paris saying, hey, Manu, what have you done for us? Nothing.
Joseph Downing, the simplest of questions needs to be asked because there's a lot of noise out there, especially if you follow this story on social media. Who the hell are these people? Who's leading them? What do they want?
Oh, well, this is a very interesting question because there is no single they as a people. The Yellow Vest movement has attracted, it started off, I think, with this sort of upper working, lower middle classes that felt their standard of living was being squeezed. It has sucked in, especially in the violence we've seen on the streets of Paris, those from the far right and those from the far left as well. So there is no one central concern. There is no one central leadership. And this, I think, is where it's easy to overstate the significance of this movement and overstate its longevity. I actually don't foresee a situation where this is going to be important as a movement in France ongoing, because we've already seen the support for the Yellow Vest movement nationally drop from around the high 80s, so it was quoted at 88% 2 weeks ago, down to around 66% over the weekend. So we're already seeing the appeal of this movement tail off, and we're actually going to see with the reforms that Macron's promised in hiring the minimum wage, he will actually alienate many people from pushing for more concessions, because they see France as overly regulated, as lazy, people as overly paid. They actually want someone who's going to bring in free market reforms. This is where France is an extremely complex political landscape that defies sort of simplistic explanations, I think.
Right. So, Jen, we had Joseph mention the polls. More than 80% of the people in the country supported the protest. Now it's down to the 60s, still pretty high. Let me look at some other polls in terms of who they were protesting against, Macron and the ruling elite. Only 16% of the French think that political leaders take their opinions into account. That's an IEP survey. And 83% believe politicians ignore them. What does that tell us about France, Jen, and what does that tell us about what's playing out on the streets?
Right. So, as someone who does research on social movements, as a movement like this, as a popular movement is unfolding, it's really a moving target to keep track of what's going on. And I think some of the poll numbers that were mentioned in some ways reflect people saying, I don't support the specific violence. But overall, if you talk to people, especially outside Paris, there's a very anti-Paris, anti-institutional, anti-Macron, anti-elite sentiment that is not going to disappear overnight. And it's true, we don't know what kind of shape this movement is going to take. But no matter what, when a popular movement arises such as this, and they've happened historically before the internet, before Facebook, that if an organization on the ground that organically comes up from the movement itself, if that doesn't really develop in this case, other organizations are going to come in and fill that vacuum. And we've already seen that with both far left, far right leaders. We've seen bots and other fake news. But none of that is going to really take away from the sentiment and the anger that many in France have for the establishment.
Yeah, and people have said that this has played out in 4 acts so far. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leftist leader, says a 5th act is soon underway. Have a little listen to what he had to say.
I believe that the 5th act to be played out next Saturday, the 5th act of the beginning of the citizens' revolution that is happening in our country, will be a moment of great mobilization. But of course, like everyone, I know the decision will be made by those on the ground.
Craig Copetas, is Mélenchon just trying to smuggle himself into something that is giving him renewed political capital, or is this serious? Would Macron's words possibly be not enough for both the left and the right?
My take on covering this story is that people who are not here are really overestimating the power of the far left and the far right in France to form any meaningful group as a unit or even as a coalition. France is a republic. There are 577 seats in the French National Assembly, of which Macron controls over 300. There are at most 50 to 55 anti-Macronites in the National Assembly. Macron is not going anywhere, at least until 2022. There are provisions for what they call here destitution, which is impeachment. But Macron is nowhere near the bar for anyone to bring impeachment proceedings against him. So whether the French like it or not, whether Europe likes it or not, whether those who are supporting the Paris Climate Accords like it or not, Macron is in charge until 2022. There is no organized political opposition to him. He wiped out the center left and he wiped out the Socialist Party here, to the point that the Socialist Party had to sell off some of its real estate. This is Emmanuel Macron's show.
So, Joseph Downing, is that the reason why we're seeing a medley of messages and we can't quite figure out who's out on the streets? Because it's a bunch of people. You can't quite reduce the protester to one particular psychographic or demographic.
100% I agree with that. I think, and this is the thing with a spontaneous social movement, is because there is no leader, because there is no set manifesto, because there are no conditions, if you will, upon which you have to fulfill to join, everyone can invest whatever they think that is their grievance in the Yellow Vest movement, which to me sums up one of the sort of intractable dilemmas of French politics, which is when you do polls, when you ask people, people want reform. But reform is a word like justice or democracy. Of course, we all want it. But what does it mean? And when you begin to then tap down and say to people, OK, so what do you really want? The diversity of voices is not only staggering, but it becomes clear that people don't want reform of their own privileges. And to me, the real lack that Macron, in his credibility as a reformer, has been his inability to attack the parasitic French state, which hoovers up a huge amount of French GDP, which spends, euros as if they're going out of fashion. And to me, if Macron was to make, serious concessions, it would be the reform of the state, the reform of ministerial privileges. But like everyone else in France, he wants reform to other constituencies, not his own.
Jen Schradie, is that fair? Oh, okay. Wait, bring in Craig. Come in, and then Jen. Is that fair, Craig? That Macron doesn't want to reform the parasitic French state?
No, what the people on the street want is very simple. Show me the money. And Macron doesn't have any. He's got a $2.7 trillion and growing national debt. He's paying $62 billion a year interest on the principal. He's not even paying off the debt. He doesn't have the money. All of those numbers are increasing. And one of the demands of the protesters, as amorphous as they might be, and this is critical here, they're demanding debt forgiveness, which is something you do in an African third world country. You don't do that in a Western democracy that's operating under the normalcies of capitalism. But this is one of their major demands. The other factor here, briefly, Imran, is the people in France believe that when they pay their taxes, that money is going to pay for services for them and their fellow citizens. The majority of that money goes to service the interest on the principal. It doesn't go back into the country. When they need more money, they go out and make another bond offer, or they go to the market for a loan. So what Macron has here is an arithmetic problem. He doesn't have the money the people are asking for.
Jen, is that true? Is it all about the money?
The money is definitely a key part, but the key thing, the other key thing to remember is that people are up in arms that the wealthy have been given tax cuts, right? And so I think if we say they don't have the money, it depends on who's being taxed and who's not. And I think if we look at, other social movements, for example, the Tea Party movement in the United States, which was also on the surface anti-tax. T stands for taxed enough already. But the Tea Party movement, which was a very conservative movement, was against government intervention. That's not what's happening here with the Gilets jaunes. They're wanting the government to do something. They're anti-Macron, they're anti-elite, but they are, very happy that, overall, some people want more, but very pleased with Macron's announcement yesterday for 100 more euros per month in the minimum wage. They're wanting more of that. And that's what we'll see in terms of the types of demands that continue to be made.
Joseph Downing.
Look, Jen's making an excellent point here, because all of the humble pie that Macron ate last night in his 13 minutes of pre-recorded video, the most important slice he served up was when he said that they had to keep the wealth tax off the books, because if they went back to the wealth tax, Macron said, more and more people would leave France. They would not only see capital flight, they would also see intellectual flight. So what this comes down to is growth. There is no growth in France. Conventional economic wisdom says those with money institute growth. Again, as Jen pointed out, and our other guest pointed out, the French imperial system is not geared towards a growth economy vis-a-vis the new global economy. The only place you will see any growth in France are in big corporations, most of which have substantial shareholding by the state. If you want to make money in France, the best place to go is the United States, not here if you're just starting out, if you're a millennial. That's why Macron cannot reinstitute the wealth tax.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, looking at it in terms of foundational issues with the whole way France runs its economy. Joseph Downing, back to the people on the streets, and I'll let this be the final word. It's been a restless time on the continent over the past few years. Europe is certainly not boring anymore for outsiders. How would you compare the nationalism and the populism on display on the streets of Paris to other movements on the continent that we've seen over the past couple years?
To me, it seems as if what all of these movements share is they share in a sort of anger and a discontent with a system really of growing inequality in Europe. We've seen the erosion of the middle classes and the privileges of the working classes in the UK since Thatcherism. but this is something that's occurring across all major European economies, which is presenting the political establishment with a real problem. And we can see in France what we also see in the UK and what we also see perhaps beginning to play out in the US, which is a breakdown of the established rules of politics. People didn't really see this in some ways when Macron got to power because he's a centrist, but the fact that someone from outside, even though he's not really that outside, but he's outside enough, given how closed the French political system was prior to Macron, for someone like him to be able to take the presidency is remarkable. And this is what we're seeing across the continent, really, is the breakdown of the established rules of politics. We see it here in the UK, and we're beginning to see it in France. What I'm worried about in the French case is, if Macron is unpopular, who emerges to fill the vacuum in 2022? Not the centre-left, not the centre-right, I would argue not the far-right even, because Marine Le Pen seems to have, and the National Front have imploded since the election. But who will rise to fill this vacuum? That, for me, is the sort of worrying next question.
Okay, gentlemen and the lady, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed having that discussion. Jen Schradie, Joseph Downing, and Craig Copetas, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.